situation?
Well, I can only speak as an observer of events. I cannot claim to any special insider knowledge. But what you have is Israel attempting over 16 months of subjugation of Gaza. It has failed. It has used every form of diplomatic pressure around the world to bully other governments into supporting what it's doing. It has used all manner of firepower on a civilian population. It has visited upon the people of Gaza all manner of indignity. It has literally killed its own captives that are held as prisoners of war in Gaza. And it has not been able to iron out these contradictions. It's driven its own economy toward an abyss. It has bankrupted its Eilat port thanks to the humanitarian intervention of Yemen and other actors too. It has literally not been able to return over 100,000 settlers to what they perceive to be their homes within occupied Palestine, despite a horrendous war on southern Lebanon and the killing of some key figures and leaders within the movement in Lebanon to liberate their land and liberate Palestine. So Israel has failed in all of its supposed objectives and is now restarting the genocide, which Donald Trump gave them a green light to do. And this is a seriously concerning situation. But what you have seen is the resistance continue to act. Who would have thought that after 16 months, after all manner of killing taking place in Gaza, that you would have rockets fired from out of Gaza, named after Izzuddin al-Qassam, who was killed by the British in 1935, raining down on Tel Aviv? Who would think that after Donald Trump, certainly Trump wouldn't have thought this, that after striking Yemen in the way he has, and bear in mind, some of the structures that have been hit in Yemen are thousands of years old. What is the United States? You are talking about a 200-year-old settler colonial uncivilization, if you can call it a civilization, up against Hadramaut, Yemen, the cradle of civilization, buildings which are thousands of years old being struck in Yemen, and still the Yemeni resistance refuse to kowtow to US diktats in a way that all of the political leaders in the region, with the exception of the Axis of Resistance and Iran, have done. They have all kowtowed to US diktats. And that's really why you have in the region the axis of resistance and the axis of assistance. And actually, this time around, the axis of assistance is even more barefaced in front of its own populations than any other time previously. What these resistance forces in the region have done is not only establish clarity within Palestine, they have established clarity across the region on who are the slaves and who are the masters. And really, in spite of all of the efforts of the Israelis and the Americans now, with Trump full on board, like Genocide Joe was, and practically and possibly more with this new introduction of the mother of all bombs given to the Israelis, they have not been able to achieve their objectives and really are seriously looking like anything they say they want to achieve, they actually get the exact opposite. Would anyone think that after 16 months, Israel was not able to return all of the captives and get rid of this political movement in Gaza, which won an election to be the legitimate government of Palestine? I would definitely be interested to hear what the professor has to say about these regional developments, but we are at a really critical juncture.
But now the genocide, the war, the campaign, the brutal campaign by Israel has been relaunched with the US's blessing. And it seems like the dominoes are falling, Professor Marty. It seems like what's happening is exactly what Lowkey said. the quagmire is here. There's a huge human toll to this, but there's also a toll that's going to lay at the feet of the empire. What is your take on this?
I think everything that Lowkey said is absolutely correct. It's obvious that the United States, what it's doing in this region, is these are crimes against humanity, and they are complicit in the genocide in Gaza. Trump had the opportunity to present himself as a peacemaker, although I don't think most of us ever believed that to be true. But some people did have hope that he would be a peacemaker. Some people believed that he wanted to be a peacemaker. But I think he destroyed his own the little bit of soft power that he gained for himself, at least abroad, by giving the green light to this genocide and by bombing Yemen. And why is he bombing Yemen? Simply because Yemen is saying that the starvation siege must stop. It's quite stunning that if you think about it, Yemen is being bombed because they're protesting the starvation siege. Women and children are being bombed because Yemen is saying the Israelis must allow food to get into Gaza. And Western media, from what I've seen, doesn't say this part. They don't tell their audience. They don't say on their websites. They don't say in their reports, those that I've seen. The fact that there's a reason why Yemen has stopped ships linked to the Israeli regime again, and that it was only directed at ships that were linked to the regime. It wasn't directed at international shipping. But I think if we all look back to and review what's been going over the last year and a half, I don't think anyone has any expectations of the Western media anymore. If anyone sits down and watches Western media, they're wasting their time unless they are watching or reading to critique it. So, in my opinion, Trump has harmed himself. Morality aside, the crimes aside, he's harmed himself because the facade, the mask is now off. And he has shown himself to be a partner of Netanyahu. He's shown himself. Some people try to interpret this in a way in which Trump is doing this in order to distract attention away from what's going on in Ukraine. I don't know how valid that is. It's a possibility, but it doesn't justify slaughtering innocent people. It doesn't justify genocide in Gaza. So there is no moral justification, no matter how people try to interpret this. But that aside, I think that it was inevitable that this ceasefire would collapse. When it first began, it was destined to fail because the Israeli regime is not a regime that abides by its commitments. Even before the restarting of the genocide, on average, the Zionist regime was killing a bit over 3 Palestinians on average a day in Gaza during the past couple of months, every day. If it was anywhere else in the world, this would be seen as slaughter. But 3 a day seems to be okay. That's why the West has said nothing about it. And they've been violating the ceasefire the whole time. They prevented heavy equipment from getting in, mobile homes from getting in violation of their commitments. The ability to remove the rubble. No one knows how many tens of thousands of bodies are lying under the rubble. No one knows. And they can't remove the rubble because the Israeli regime, from day one of the ceasefire, has been violating it. So, and then I have to add that in Lebanon, they've been murdering on average one person a day since the ceasefire. And they've expanded the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank extensively. in Jenin, for example, they've been destroying neighborhoods and displacing tens of thousands of people. And the same is true in other parts of the West Bank. And they've been killing people. None of this is reported in the Western media. And you have to keep in mind that the West Bank, unlike Gaza, because if you recall during the genocide, often Western reporters, their excuse would be, we don't have access. But in the West Bank, they have access. They have journalists that live in Tel Aviv and in Al-Quds or Jerusalem, and they can travel to the West Bank anytime that they want. The same is true in Lebanon during the genocidal war against Lebanon and against the resistance there. They were bombing people's homes, and the Western media was saying these are Hezbollah strongholds or they're bombing Hezbollah targets, whereas the reporters were in Beirut. They were in Lebanon. Their fixers were Lebanese. Their cameramen were Lebanese. Their drivers were Lebanese. Many of them lived in those neighborhoods. They knew they were lying. But that's how the Western media works. But in this region, people know what's going on. Even though I don't have any trust in any of the media, whether it's controlled by the Saudis or the Emirates or Qatar or anyone else, but people in the region know what's going on in Palestine. They know what's going on in Yemen. So even if the Western media deletes the part about why Yemen has been standing up against the Israeli regime, and even Al Jazeera during this recent after when Ansarullah, after I think a few days after the starvation siege, I think after a week, they said a little over a week, they said that if the Israelis don't allow food in, we're going to start within days, we're going to reinforce the blockade. And then when the Americans ultimately bombed Yemen, Al Jazeera Arabic wouldn't explain why the Americans why Ansarullah is being bombed. They wouldn't say that Ansarullah is blocking ships going to Israel. So while the Ansarullah in Yemen and the axis of resistance is their voices are not being heard through mainstream media, but people in this region know what's going on. And this intensifies outrage. This creates greater outrage. And as Lowkey was saying, that this has delegitimized these dictatorships, these family dictatorships, these military dictatorships more than ever before, even more than the previous round. And I would add that, and this you may not agree, but in a sense, stopping the genocide and then restarting the genocide in the eyes of the global public is even more ugly. Because when the Israelis began the genocide, and we people across the world were seeing these scenes day and night, everyone was disgusted, it delegitimized the regime. But when ultimately there was a ceasefire of sorts, there was a collective sigh of relief. People across the world were saying, well, at least we're not going to see these horrible images anymore. And then the regime suddenly restarts these atrocities. I think that makes it extra disgusting. It creates even greater outrage because people were expecting that this would come to an end permanently, or at least for the next few years. So I believe that the regime has harmed itself. Of course, the slaughter is painful to watch, and it is something that all of us just pray that it will end immediately. But the longer that this lasts, the worse it is for the Israeli regime, the worse it is for the American camp in this region. And at some point, something will happen. At some point, something will happen. Remember, when the so-called Arab Spring began, or the awakening, at that time, everyone thought, or at least overwhelmingly, people thought that the region was quiet. But some young man, because of a personal grievance in a city in Tunisia, burned himself alive. That brought down the government. And then it brought down the government in Egypt. And it created chaos across West Asia and North Africa. The situation today is far more volatile and far more dangerous and unstable, not just in the region, across the world, than it was back then. So the more the Americans push, the Israelis push, the more they're creating the possibility for grave difficulties for themselves beyond the difficulties and the failures that Lowkey has already alluded to.
I'm curious about your thoughts on the order of operations of this exploding war in West Asia, genocidal war in West Asia, because it began with this intense UK and US. You're based in the UK, so certainly comment on that US operation to eliminate Ansarallah. And then suddenly, not too long after that, we had the explosion of the war with now the genocide in full force. I'm curious on your thoughts on why this is happening in this moment right now. What about this moment do you believe brought on this onslaught?
Well, let's be clear. The British have been trying and failing to subjugate Yemen since 1839. You have seen across the decades and centuries attempts to enforce the will of the British government on people in Yemen, also attempts to divide the country in different ways. And actually, throughout the Saudi war on Yemen, you had an estimated 7,000 employees of UK contractor companies, civil servants, and military personnel aiding the Saudis in that war. You had tens of, at least that we know of British mercenaries on the ground in Yemen at the time. And overall, 377,000 people were killed by that war in Yemen. Now, what was the result of it? With the British, the Saudis, the UAE, and all of the Gulf media backing them, they able to defeat this movement. And actually, and it's important that we state here that Iran has been a key target of the United States from the beginning of the revolution in 79. But you had a situation where the US were not able to react in time because the closest military base that they had to Iran at that time was in Diego Garcia, which was thousands of miles away. It wasn't until the Gulf War that the Americans were able to build up their military presence in the region. And before that, you had the Nixon doctrine, you had the Carter idea of invading via Zagros Mountains. Iran has always been a target. However, there is a key misunderstanding in the ways these anti-colonial movements, whether it be in Yemen or Palestine or in Lebanon, function vis-a-vis Iran. Rather than understanding these as organic movements that come from below, that just happen to have the support of Iran for their own organic aims. These are not proxy groups in any way, shape, or form. These are independence movements which are directly connected in an umbilical way to the independence movements which fought the British and took part in the process of decolonization, which actually the majority of the states in the world are the result of decolonization. What you have now is a process of decolonization against neocolonialism and against Zionist settler colonialism playing out in the region. It just so happens that Iran has the same position of supporting those movements. It is not that Iran controls those movements. Quite the opposite. These movements do whatever they want vis-a-vis liberating their own land. And Iran says to them, how can we help? How can we help? That in and of itself is actually a supreme act of altruism, which the rest of humanity should turn around and learn from rather than demonizing. What is happening with Yemen will fail now because the United States and Britain do not have within them the stamina to kill over 300,000 Yemeni people the way the Saudis did, which in fact is their proxy. They call the other groups proxies because the people that they are backing are proxy groups. And they failed in Yemen. They brought 1 million people to the brink of starvation in that country. And Trump is under the bizarre misconception that these airstrikes will quell something which is from the ground up and is organic. He's clearly confused, because the Israelis, who have far more of a taste for killing people by the thousand, have not succeeded doing it in Gaza with a group that is far more besieged than the Yemenis are. And what you also have to remember within this equation is that the neutralizing of the Syrian front in the way that it has happened is not a developing process. It's something that, if you look at, for example, a Jolani, the Daesh leader of Syria now, from Jabhat al-Nusra. Jabhat al-Nusra is one of 12 groups that Elizabeth Surkov, the Israeli spy who has been taken captive in Iraq, wrote about in Foreign Policy magazine. These 12 Syrian opposition groups were funded by the Israelis from that point. And one of them was Jabhat al-Nusra. And Jabhat al-Nusra had its fighters being trained by Israeli physicians and doctors in a field hospital that they set up specifically for that purpose. Now, there's an interesting way in which this plays back into the UK. Of course, the UK was intimately involved in Operation Timber Sycamore. But when Priti Patel, who at that time was the British Foreign Secretary, had 13 meetings with Israeli government figures, including Netanyahu, without informing the British government, one of the promises she wanted to make to the Israelis was that she would use money from DFID, which is the British Foreign Office, and direct it to the Golan Heights in order to disguise Israel's funding of Syrian groups there. And so one of those groups that would have received that funding, if Priti Patel was successful in this endeavor, would have been Jabhat al-Nusra. And so this relationship between a Jolani is not will he or won't he. He is. He's there to serve Israeli objectives. He's there for moments like this. He was there not only to neutralize the Syrian front totally, and that's not to say that the previous regime took the position of the Yemenis. In fact, the Yemenis wanted to open the front and offered to open the front themselves, but were refused by the previous regime. But that is, Jolani has neutralized the Syrian front to the extent that Israel has expanded onto the edge of Damascus. This is unprecedented. So we have to look at these developments across the region with a clear eye and see the way and excavate the way that that has come to be. Because ultimately, what is often used about Iran are those that say, oh, Iran supports the Palestinian cause for its own interests. What interests are those? Explain to me today, what are the personal narrow interests of any state in the world to even raise its voice in support of Palestine, let alone, in the words of Ziad Nakhala, the leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, give billions to Palestinian resistance organizations over decades? Show me the material interest. Do those Palestinian groups pay back the money that they've been given? Do they offer something in return for the training and for the weaponry? They don't. Maybe there are some ways I'm not privy to or aware of. But simply put, the only reason Trump wants to bomb Iran is Palestine. Be honest. Be honest. There, of course, is the danger of an alternative example. But yes, that would definitely mean economic warfare and other things. But when we're talking about support for the Palestinians, it is a red line. Even the South African government bringing a case in the ICJ is not palatable to the United States. Even that is beyond the pale, is too far. So in the case of these resistance forces, it's important to, number one, understand them as nothing like proxies. That is a caricature which is used to serve Western imperial interests. And number two, to understand that at this time, those standing with Palestine are the best of humanity. And those standing with Palestine, from Palestine Action here to Yemen, understand the stakes of that position. They understand the cost of that position. And that deserves the utmost respect and honor of the masses of humanity. Because actually, the majority of humanity stands with the Palestinians. The governments which designate Palestinian armed resistance as a form of terrorism represent ostensibly less than 1 billion human beings in this world. You're talking about the EU, fine. You're talking about the United States, a couple 100 million people. You're talking about Britain, 67 million people. Throw in Japan, you're talking about less than 1 billion people. What about the rest of the governments in the world? What about China? What about Venezuela? What about Brazil? What about Pakistan? What about Turkey? What about Iraq? You're reaching over 1 billion people, are easily represented by governments that turn around and say, well, actually, not only is armed resistance to occupation and settler colonialism not evil, there's actually an inherent goodness. It is the most articulate expression of love for other people. And that is something that ultimately people need to get to grips with and understand about what is happening.